Hello everyone. As we're heading into winter weather in the Northern Hemisphere, I thought I would cover weather rules a bit in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. When I started preparing for this video, I just went to Archives and Ethos and did a search, assuming that there would be one rule collected in a single place. But as you can see from my collection of tabs, and the fact that I went through both the core rulebooks as well, there isn't. So I'm going to try and break down running adverse winter weather conditions in Pathfinder. However, this is not comprehensive and is mostly focused on getting immediate utility out of the way. So right here is the main adverse weather and terrain quote in the GM core. It quite simply says, exploration gets slower when the party faces dense jungles, deep snow, sandstorms, extreme heat, or similar difficult conditions. You decide how much these factors impact the character's progress. The specific effects of certain types of terrain and weather are described starting on page 90. So from here, I went to the GM core. However, I have a pre-remaster version, so I wasn't sure if it would be on the same page. And I have this open right now, and page 90 is cursed items in the older version. So it wasn't there. And since I don't have the new version, I couldn't use the page citation. And I also couldn't find exactly the same thing on Archives and Ethos. So from here, I continued looking for more things. So there's wild weather. It also does not have rules put in here. It just gives certain flavor and in-world suggestions, like extreme temperatures being the only thing that has an effect, not more mild temperatures. However, it does mention it can leave PCs worn out, and then it mentions light levels, and again, not a lot. Then difficult terrain, it just says cuts movement by half, and this is also in the encounter rules. So it's the biggest rule to look at here. Basically, if your party is in difficult terrain, with the case of winter weather, that would be deep snow, hail, something like that, then their movement is cut by half. So in a combat scenario, that means that to move 1 square, you have to spend 10 feet of movement rather than 5 feet, and you can't step into difficult terrain. Usually, if you're dealing with heavy snow, this will apply to everyone in the encounter. So enemies are affected as much as PCs are. Running from the same prior rules, you might choose to limit visibility past a certain distance. For instance, you might provide half cover or any other cover variant. I'll pull open that rule here. You might provide lesser, standard, or greater cover past certain distances. For instance, if it's heavy snow and you can't see really at all past, say, your hand, you might apply lesser cover to everyone within 10 feet, and then standard cover to people past that, and then greater cover to anyone past, say, 20 feet. And you can make it so that that extends over time. I will note that this rule can make things somewhat more complex, because you have to track the individual vision range of each character. However, it could be an effective way to represent a heavy blizzard that your characters are walking through. There's also a mention of environmental hazards, again referencing page 90, but again, I don't have that. So instead, what I have found was, in the older version, there was a little section on simple hazards, one of which was snowfall. So the way that snowfall is described is that you can roll a DC 16 stealth check to avoid knocking it down on you, and then to disable it, it's a DC 19 survival check. And if a creature triggers it, the snow falls on their head and deals 2d6 plus 3 bludgeoning damage and soaks their clothing, which makes it so that cold environments are treated as 1 step colder. And it was there that I started looking for cold effects. I'm going to try to pull it open here. So there's another weather hazard appearing there, which is from Kingmaker. And that's how I got connected to the Kingmaker weather experience. So this is a random encounter in the adventure path that on Archives of Nethys, and it lays out weather event type names. So basically, the way these weather events are laid out is, first off, there's a survival DC. A character who attempts a survival check and succeeds will be warned about the upcoming event, and if they're paying attention, they have an additional chance to notice. Additionally, under the actual description, it's broken into preparation, routine, and action. So preparation is basically what players can do to prevent the effects. So if they build a shelter to protect from a heavy storm, then that could potentially stave off the impact or reduce it down to nothing, depending on how well they do. Then there's a routine, which happens every so often during the event. So it's what the event does, how long it lasts, and what PCs can do to deal with it. So the duration is listed in parentheses. If I pull open Blizzard here, then it's survival DC 25 to realize it's happening. That's an expert DC as mentioned here. For preparation, it's DC 21 survival to notice, and DC 25 nature to notice it by interpreting the behavior of wildlife. Then, for the Blizzard's duration, which it lists as 8 or more hours, visibility is reduced, causing a -4 penalty to perception checks. This is an alternative to the various distances I had mentioned from the other rules. However, the effects will be slightly different in that this will have a more consistent negative impact, whereas what I mentioned would be slightly more gentle in some scenarios. Then the temperature drops to severe cold, which right here is a link to the temperature rules. So what happens with these? As mentioned here, it just says severe cold, and then an unsheltered character takes 2d6 damage every hour from the blizzard. And you can attempt to prevent exposure by building shelter or finding it. Then it's difficult terrain for a while afterwards. But here's the temperature rule. So the way that temperature works with Pathfinder is basically there's temperature ranges in degrees Fahrenheit. I don't think there is a conversion to Celsius right here, and I generally use Fahrenheit, so can't be too helpful there. But the way it works is it changes the amount of time in a certain temperature needed to cause fatigue. So in a typical situation, characters can grow fatigued after 8 hours of travel, and this is listed in the travel rules. However, in mild cold or mild heat, this decreases to 4 hours. It does note that for heat, you should adjust down temperatures by 15 degrees Fahrenheit. So in a humid region, anytime the temperature is above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the characters get fatigued in half the time. This also applies for cold, where it's between 13 and 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's below freezing. So snow will be happening if there's precipitation. It does note that cold weather gear can negate the damage from cold or reduce it down a step. So the damage dealt is minor and then moderate, depending on the level of heat or cold. So for severe cold, which is below 12 degrees Fahrenheit, you deal minor cold damage every hour. So minor damage is most likely just 1d6. I don't have the table in front of me. Then for minor fire, it's the exact same thing. You will note that the fatigue continues to set in at the same value until you get to truly extreme temperatures, which should very rarely occur. However, the more minor temperatures could easily trigger, and the fatigue is the main thing to track, because the fatigue condition can be fairly severe for many characters. The damage is somewhat less dangerous to higher level characters, but it could easily take out a low level party. Generally, I only enforce these rules if my party has decided to be, well, stupid. So if you decide to go up the mountain in the middle of a snowstorm, I will impose full penalties. I do not care what level you are. But as long as they show general caution, it shouldn't be applying. And here are the links to other rules. I will put all of these in the description of the video. So there's precipitation. It can impose a circumstance penalty on perception checks, and it can cause concealment status, just as I guessed from the earlier rule. Then it can impose fatigue within 4 hours in all cases. It also notes that soaked characters will treat temperatures 1 step lower. So if your characters are in mild cold and there's usually no effect, then if they get drenched by snow because of poor preparation, they'll start taking damage every hour until they can warm up. Then lastly, it mentions thunderstorms. Basically, a thunderstorm, it says, will usually not do anything, but there's a small chance that a character might be struck by lightning, dealing moderate to major electricity damage. I'm guessing that every time they're saying this, they're referencing the hazards and traps damage table, which can be found in building hazards, defenses, offense, simple and complex, and then there's a separate table for bi-level damage. I just don't remember where it is at the moment. I'll add it in the description if I do remember. So continuing on the weather effects. Here is the wind effect. So it can interfere with ranged attacks, imposing a circumstance penalty on them and sometimes making them impossible. It can snuff out flames, and it also causes a penalty to movement, basically making it so that characters have to make an athletics check to avoid being knocked over. The last environment thing here is, well, natural disasters. So more acute dangers, which happen somewhat more rarely, but it can still happen. So the first one in this list is avalanche. This would mostly happen in cold weather if you're, say, up on a mountain or under a overhang or anything like that. It's somewhat uncommon, but if the characters are tempting fate, it's very possible for this to happen. Basically, it says for burial, if your characters get caught under it and can't dodge, then they'll take minor cold damage and minor bludgeoning damage every single minute. There could also be a chance of suffocation, but it leaves that up to GM's discretion. It says that anyone standing nearby can attempt to dig out a creature by doing athletics checks. Shovels or other proper tools makes it quicker. Then it mentions blizzards, which just says impose all the things I previously mentioned with the cold weather, heavy snow, and strong winds. Then the last couple of things in here are not directly attached to cold weather, except I'm going to talk a little bit about the floods here. It basically says treat it like an avalanche but with liquid. The times that floods can occur in this case is if the temperature is warmed significantly. So, for example, spring flooding is fairly common in regions near mountains because it gets cold early, there's a lot of snowfall, and then it all melts and goes into the various rivers. And that can cause damage, but it usually floods slowly. This mentions a flash flood. A flash flood scenario happens with a sudden change in weather, like if characters are in a narrow crevice between two mountains, then a flash flood can occur in that location. They're most common in canyons and other similar crevices, basically. In general, flooding should not appear much with cold weather adventures, but it might happen with a trap or a ill-planned expedition. I hope this was helpful in understanding these rules. I started going through them myself shortly before the video, and at this point I believe that by putting this together, you have the best way to run the encounters. I'll put my citations and links in the description of the video. Thank you for watching.